Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again tonight Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Greetings.
I know your interests go in many directions, up and down mountains, into river valleys, into obscure, different intellectual pursuits. But let's just stay with the geography, a part of your interest. And maybe
Yes,
we've had a little discussion about the impact of geography on political systems and actually armed forces in our history. And I'll start out by maybe asking you this question, at least the idea that that civilization arises where there's a relatively temperate climate. If it is too cold, then it won't work, or if it's too hot, it won't work either. So the civilizations are under the impact of geography to great degrees, and particularly in river valleys, the 5 famous river valleys where great collections of humans arose, and they went under tyrannical systems, I would say, with a supportive priesthood, and out of that hatched what some people might call civilization.
Yes.
Well, all right. Now, having said that, I will now let you segue as to whichever direction you'd like to take the subject into the influence of geography on political and social structures.
Well, thank you. And that was a very good opening serve. The reason I wanted to go in this direction is some of the ideas that we were visiting in our last episode, if our viewers saw that, regarding immigration and how you had been ill-used by the Customs Service.
I was quite a nip.
Yes, when they broke into
I've recovered, I think, from it, but just
books,
barely.
Yes. I've had my own suitcases open for much less reason. Yes.
Really?
So a little note there saying inspected.
Oh, really? Is
whatever.
that common? I think it never happened to
Oh,
me.
yes, it happens. And I was just off to the Caribbean, so
Somebody
I guess they
opened your
assumed I was
suitcase?
bringing in
They do that.
The
And
powder patrol had to
let me
stop
say
me,
this
so.
is implied consent that allowed them
Implied
to open it.
consent, yes,
Right,
so.
yeah, I've heard that somewhere. Right.
Yes, some idiot came up with that idea.
Yes.
But yes, at any rate, the idea of immigration and the idea of how the Europeans, of which we're an offshoot, got started. If you look at the great powers of the world, they all fit into one of 2 categories. Either they are great continental powers or they are great maritime powers. And continental powers are such because they control a large land mass with a lot of natural resources on it. But if you've ever played the game of Risk, which I'm sure you are, the larger the land mass, the longer the borders.
No, I'm unfamiliar with that
Yes.
one, but you expected me to be unfamiliar,
Yes.
I think.
I did not. I thought you might play
Risk.
the game Risk.
I rarely play
Yes,
games.
but the longer the borders, the harder they are to police, because the greater chance there is that some of these borders are just lines on a map. And probably the greatest example of that today would be the western border of Russia. Why does Russia keep getting invaded by people in Central and Eastern Europe? Because it's just, there's no natural boundary there. So to defend yourself, you have to develop a strong central government that can tax people and raise armies and build very expensive fortifications, which leads to potential dictatorships. Whereas a maritime country is one that has excellent harbors and is insular. It's protected from the rest of the world by lakes or rivers or mountain chains or oceans, which means they engage in trade, which means they tend to say free enterprise and private property rights are extremely important. And they don't need to build up big armies and have conscription, which means they tend to be devoted to civil liberties a lot more. And if you analyze that, I always, when I tell my students about this, I say, now which one do you think the United States is traditionally? So I will throw that question to you.
Good, I can segue into that, and it's, I would say both. And I would draw a comparison with Imperial Germany. So they had put maybe that caused a lot of problems when they tried to transform themselves into a sea power with briefly. But I mean, so yes, the U.S. is a big country. It has obviously a maritime situation, and it's insular, however, in that as far as big armies go, it doesn't particularly need one, and so that has an impact. If one stays with that polarity, I'd say it has the capability of being both. However, it has no natural enemies, and if any enemies came at the country, it would probably be a seaborne assault traditionally. But a big country has resources to play the way in both directions.
Well,
so you're going to say it's
yeah. That's a very astute answer, and I think it's very defensible. I think that prior to World War II, the answer would be unquestionably sea power. It's very hard to be a leading sea power and a leading continental power at the same time. I would argue the only state that has ever truly been able to do it was Rome, and that for a limited period of time after the Punic Wars. But yes, the thing that tends to throw my students off are that continentally we are much, much bigger than the average maritime power, and we are more resource rich. But our borders, we haven't had a border danger because Canada, we and the Canadians are first cousins. We're culturally similar. We're politically similar. Yeah, there's ill will. There have been invasions over the past, but it's more like a family squabble. Mexico, and that's a different matter. And Mexico is what, up until the last generation or so, would be called a third world country. It just didn't have the industrial ability to pose a serious military threat to the United States. And so while we have those open borders, we didn't have the same need to police them as, say, Germany and Russia or China versus the steppe people of that sort. We traditionally had extremely small and fairly poorly trained and equipped armies, except during actual wartime. But then comes World War II, modern technology, modern communications, high-speed weapons of war, nuclear weapons, and air power. And this potentially messes up the entire dynamic. And from that moment on, we start maintaining a massive peacetime army, pour the expenditures into it, face not necessarily invasion, but simply nuclear annihilation. Now in the post-Cold War world, we are getting a threat that's not military, it's just demographic, as hundreds of thousands of people pour across the Latin American border and threaten to change essentially the ground rules by which the country has traditionally operated. And once again, as individuals, these people are coming in, they're throwing the dice, they are risking their lives, they're moving away from everything they knew to do really demanding jobs here that help our economy, and in that way they are in the best tradition of American immigrants. But taken as a group, they are fundamentally changing what America is.
So we've had a conversation about statehood, nationhood, nation states, the way the world is. On that subject, maybe I'll ask the question, is the ethos, the cultural ethos, the morality of the world, is that in some ways become less peculiar to different countries? So in other words, I don't know, you have a very strong Islamic country or a very strong Buddhist country or a very secular country. Is the idea now that there's everything is merged a little bit, and a lot of it is sort of climate worship, sort of early nature worship. We have these issues out there. Is that one of the things going on along with the immigration is the sense of intellectual differences or religious differences and ethical differences that are between different nations? That maybe that's become more blurred, maybe?
I think to a degree, and I think one of your old professors, Henry Kissinger, has a really interesting book on that world order that came out a few years ago, and he he looks at 3 or 4 really big sort of meta-civilizations, one being the Western tradition, another being the Middle Eastern tradition, and then the Asian sort of China-dominated position. But yeah, if we go back to the Declaration of Independence, and this is another one I ask my students, this is not a statement of rights of Americans or even rights of people within the British Empire. It's a universal declaration of human rights. And we seem to have sort of extended that. And you can follow that down through our immigration policies or lack thereof. I mean, all the way down to Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That we say that these things apply to everyone, not just Americans. I think that tends to make us want to open up the borders.
Well, the French were there. I mean, you could make this the rights of man.
Oh yes,
which
Jefferson probably
Thomas,
was involved in. So
now he's a dethroned, I guess, saintly figure. I mean, he's no longer considered morally pure.
Yes.
But in any event, he certainly played a role in 2 major revolutions and intelligently saw many of the problems that face the world. So that's a rather good thing. Well, we're just segueing back and forth between geography, which whatever that does, and armed forces and the different ethnic events that happen. And I'll ask this question. Presumably, a major event would be the armed forces that different nation states, to use that word, adopt. And so if they're in a geographical situation that allows them to have a navy and defend themselves with the navy, they're going to be involved with commerce, and they'll be more agile. The government will be less powerful. The rigidity of a continental power will be less obvious, where a continental power will try and impose a draconian order on its citizens, and it will insist they salute when the flag goes by pretty readily, and they'll also fight with other countries, quibbling over land of one sort or another. All right, that might be the situation. But and you mentioned the change that World War II wrought. But isn't that a universal change? So the impact of geography, is there something more complicated going on in the age of computers and the extraordinary power of the internet, and that countries are not so bound up by mountains and seacoast, but by their how well they're wired, if one can use that word. We're really wired well here. And our culture and ethos are going to be dependent on how well we're connected to the extraordinary. I've said this before in a book, the world brain. So the world brain is there. It's producing different tremendous ideas about what's real and not real, what's true and not true, what science can do or not do, discovery, causality. AI, all that stuff is out there, to use a contemporary word for it. But if you're really connected and everybody is 1, 2, 3 on that, is that the big deal? Are mountains incidental and seacoast incidental now?
Oh, not at all. But it depends on whether you're talking in terms of trade or projection of military power or ideas. I think you get very different answers depending on which of these you're answering. So for instance, if you're talking about projection of force, one of the things that, for instance, shocked America so much about Sputnik or the Cuban Missile Crisis or Yuri Gagarin was that we had felt secure behind our oceans up to that moment. And then suddenly we didn't. And you see, I think it is not at all coincidental. There's a lot of talk about UFOs and are they real right now in legitimate media circles, because there's some whistleblowers of high repute who are saying, look, the government's been lying to us about this. But the first really big UFO craze emerged right after World War II and just about a year before the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb. And I don't think that's coincidental that we felt for the first time vulnerable. Whereas if you talked to the Soviets or today Russia, it's like, hey, that's old news. Now you know what we've been living with for the last 500 years. This sense of insecurity is nothing new to us. If you ask the Chinese, you get the same result. If you talk about trade, yes, modern technology has completely revolutionized trade. If you look at, and this begins in the late 1800s, the Trans-Siberian Railway, the U.S. Transcontinental Railway, Suez, the Panama Canal. These things make the world metaphorically a much, much smaller place. It makes trade much cheaper. It gives us all access to the necessities and luxuries of life in a much more realistic way. If you talk about technology, on the other hand, what has technology done but to make us realize in a wired society such as ours how much we truly differ from each other and hate each other? It hasn't brought us together. Now what we do is share cat memes and enter endless arguments of ideology with total strangers on the internet and end up calling them idiots and Nazis and worse. So I think that's tearing us apart rather than bringing us together.
Well, I'm as a person that doesn't routinely indulge in that sort of thing, okay. Presumably,
you're a smart man.
Many people do. They
yes.
While away the idle hours by trading insults on the internet with other people. Okay,
yes.
All right. I guess that's out there. It's rather a complicated story, isn't it, about warfare, security, and maybe this is really part of the human condition. I mean, maybe I've said this before, but the brain structure being what it is, it certainly promotes the idea of a cyclical view of history, because the brain it's bicameral. It has lots of different layers in it. It's got a primitive alligator brain. It's got a godlike neopalladium, 6-layered neopalladium. These are in conflict. And these conflicts play themselves out in human society. We go back and forth. And you mentioned the word hate. That's a pretty easy word to talk about or put out there, but it's also something that's extremely difficult to repress. So if you really have to be a strong person not to let yourself be pushed aside by hatred, particularly in bad economic times, political upheavals. So those are issues that exist, and I think will continue to exist, thus meaning that we're going to have some way of different societies inflicting pain on competing societies, if one says that. And then the way that pain is administered might be with nuclear weapons, it might be with poison gas, it might be with snipers, but people certainly seem to struggle against each other. And at any one time in our great elevated world, we have wars underway, always. Wars, fighting, revolution, and one ethnic group doing something bad to another. I think one recent example of that would be in Armenia, where the little enclave in Azerbaijan it appears to be just being swallowed up with brute force by the Azerbaijanis. And this is, you could say, with our present world, we'd like to depend on the United Nations to do something. But it looks like to me one of the things going on is the power of the United Nations and the traditional ways that these upheavals were met have been substantially weakened. And now we have, I don't know, the Gang of 20 and the traditional one, or 8. And on the other side, we have the new, axis between the Russians and the Chinese and the South Africans and the Brazilians. So they're putting together all these alternative matchups that are so enormous that these matchups may encompass both a traditional, continental, and sea power. I would say, you mentioned, well, things changed in World War II. I think it's a method of understanding things that was more obvious in earlier centuries. I think particularly the 19th century would be a great example of that. Western Europe, you could say something about it. And so many times there was an ambivalence with big empires. And you mentioned Rome, which is quite an interesting empire, or nation, started as a republic, as to how they defended themselves and inflicted their power on their neighbors. And after a while, they just, I'll just go off on this tangent a little bit, they were happy with their borders. They didn't want to go into trouble the Germans too much. It was pretty cold up there. The Germans were unpleasant. Well, I think we'll stay out of Scotland. It's particularly unpleasant there. Ireland, we'll forget about that. And we'll just stay in the sunny Mediterranean. But they were at the end, their empire, their nation, a Christian one in the end, didn't make it. And that's something that historians have puzzled over. I kind of like to think a lot of it was related to struggling with Persia and fighting war after war after war. So their ability to tax people became difficult to do. Certainly their currency was inflated. And I wonder if we are not approaching that present situation. It's sort of off the subject slightly, but you want to comment on that?
No, and it's there. Of course, ever since Gibbon, and probably since long before Gibbon, there have been many different theories as to why the empire shattered. And I would say, regardless of which theory you choose, the moral decay theory, or the taxation theory, or the unfettered immigration theory,
advent of Christianity. Yes. The advent of Christianity did it.
Yes, a kinder, gentler.
Right?
Yeah, it's the first kinder, gentler religion.
Right. We can't have that kind of religion.
Yes, but whatever you pick, you can find a modern day analog to that we are living through right now, which I think is one of the things that invites us to go back and look at that. We need to get Dr. Andrew Reeves back in to discuss that, and I will work on that.
Well, let's do that. Well, now, looking at the situation, I'll ask this question. Do you think the national psyche is good enough to engage in any kind of substantial conflict with anyone, particularly China? I mean, does the country have the will? I mean, right now, what we see with all the division that's present, all the hatreds that are on the street, all of the social discord, all of the destruction of family units, all of the selfishness, etc., the way the world brings out all the mistrust, could one put the whole country together to resist a Chinese incursion, and I'll say into Taiwan? In other words, we're going to risk nuclear holocaust or a continental war, or everyone is being drafted, the economy goes down. I mean, is the country so fragile now that it could never get through any kind of situation like that?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I learned a long time ago that historians should not try to predict the future. But my gut feeling is, yes, we are very, very fragile right now. That to everything that you just said, I would also add this $33 trillion national debt that nobody even talks about anymore, and the fact that the people's representatives in Congress, that they are more part of the system than they are of the people who send them there. That as we're looking at the presidential race developing, one of the big issues is, one of the increasingly important issues to the voter is the immigration question. And if you think about it, that's what put Trump in the White House, that he made this promise. Whether or not he could have kept it, or it was reasonable to expect him to be able to keep it, is an entirely different question. But the thing that really separated him out from every other candidate in both parties, he said, I'm going to build that wall. I'm going to stop that immigration. And as soon as he came in, crickets. And so once again, there's just no political will to do that. The members of Congress, most of them are white, most of them are men. Most of them are millionaires when they leave, if not when they enter. They have very little in common with this middle and increasingly low class and increasingly brown America. That the gap between the richest and the poorest is growing. They are out of touch. They live in gated communities. They make a huge show of fighting each other in a partisan sense. But when you get right down to it, they pull together to eliminate any possible opposition from the founding of a third party. Look at what happened to the Tea Party, for instance. Yes, I think we are extremely brittle right now, and I don't know how we're going to dig our way out of it, because there seems no will to dig our way out of it.
Now, I guess in the Russian Revolution, the slogan was "Bread, Land, Peace." Mm-hmm. I don't know. The slogan now, in many circles, would be equity, diversity,
inclusion.
Inclusion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So
there are new DEI offices.
There may
diversity,
be some,
equity, inclusion
right. There
offices,
are, and so enforcing these values, which in a way could be considered possibly destructive.
Yes.
Possibly destructive, humans being what they are, and they're just widely touted. Okay, maybe that's just a phase we go through. There'll be some. The situation will become a bit more neutral with time. I don't know, but it does appear to me that the ability of the nation to do something is problematic in a lot of fashion. And looking at, you mentioned the political class, whatever that is, and I'll make a few comments on that. So people, if they look like they're voters, that's good. If they seem to, look like they're part of the people that are the majority of voters, okay. And then they have access to money somehow, getting some money, and then they have shrewd campaign coordinators that make a lot of money. So if you're a campaign expert and you've been hired in a big campaign and there's $100 million that's been raised, the voter expert here might get 10 million, or his company might. Huge amounts of money are sloshing around, and the voters are often tricked in a way, or the same way advertisements advertise toothpaste. So, who am I going to vote for in this election? Well, I've seen a couple of people on TV, and they said, I'm going to build the wall, or they might say, I'm going to give you some money, or whatever. We build a wall, and the other guy says, well, I found a way to give you a big check. And they're going back and forth. Who am I going to vote for? What are the complexities of this? And it comes down to their emotional connection with the politician, et cetera, and discussing the political corruption story. And in a way, I'll say this, I think that idealistic voters, I don't believe the forefathers really thought that would happen. I thought that self-interest would be there, and everyone would be jousting around with their own self-interest, and a compromise would appear. I don't know if they really thought there would be saintly people that would not be trying to do the best for their own purposes.
Well, I agree with that. I think the big difference is that the federal government did so much less at the time of the founding, and continued to do so little for the next 100 years.
Yes.
It's the rise of the bureaucratic administrative state, in which the government's got its fingers in everything, that the stakes go up. And of course, one of the big ones now is biology. When you start talking about such fundamental questions as when does life begin, when does life end, and how do you create that life? So I'm talking abortion, I'm talking physician-assisted suicide, I'm talking about same-sex marriage, gender identity. These issues hit you much more closely than any other issue that you can describe. I mean, even fundamental economic issues, which really gets people invested. It gets them angry. They've all got skin in the game, and so there is very little room for give and take on that issue.
Well, we're about finished. That's a germane comment. I'll make one last comment here is, well, if people expect the voters to be self-interested, why would you not expect the politicians to be the same? And they're going to feather their own nest, and you brought the point up that it's certainly possible to get a great deal of money if you wish to pursue it as a successful politician. And indeed, it seems to be the case that many people can do that. You can get money from campaigns, you can get, your brother-in-law can get a job, they can be passed along. Influence, you could have, people will somehow find a way to get money in your tin cup if you help them, and we see many examples of that all the time. And finally, the issue about inside information is pretty incredible to me.
Which Congress is exempted from.
Right. And that Nancy Pelosi said, no, we're not. Look, that's money. We're not going to walk away from that money. And so people pursue this occupation for many reasons. And one of them may be the possibility of getting very wealthy.
Yes. And
the question might be, do we have a real handle on what's going on with that? And the actual revenue, it's a fair amount of money, I think, to be in Congress. I don't know, I think it's $150,000, $170,000.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of money.
And then pensions.
Right, a great pension. However, you have to go between your hometown and D.C. There are all these issues out there. It's very expensive to maintain two houses or two homes. And the people you deal with are multimillionaires, and so it's very easy to be seduced by that.
Yes.
And to the public's disinterest.
Yes. Well, I would say that on December 6th, this country, 1941, this country was horribly divided. It wasn't until Pearl Harbor that brought them together. So short of a Pearl Harbor attack, I don't see us having any political will to push back against any long-term threat. And even if there were a type of Pearl Harbor, I'm not sure. There was September 11th, and that didn't bring us together for that long.
Well, on that note, that rather pessimistic note, we'll talk some more, and hopefully we'll have some happier ideas.
Let's hope so.
Okay, thanks for being here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.